Hi, I'm Dan Linstedt,
And I'm Sanjay Pande.
and we're here on another delightful day to bring you another Data Vaults Alliance podcast. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about building business intelligence and analytics on top of a data vault. Sanjay, I've heard a lot of people say recently that it's difficult to pull data out of a data vault at a business level. What do you think they mean by that?
Honestly, I don't consider this a technical issue. I consider this a training issue. They really should all go to proper CDVP2 training and get the training through an authorized instructor. Because of not going to training, they make many mistakes. And one of the biggest mistakes I think that I've seen is doing everything as a big bang approach. A big bang approach is if the team tries to implement everything at each layer of their solution in one big bang, that's not the right way to do it. Dan, you want to highlight the issues with that and what we actually do?
I've heard a lot of people say, well, we have to get, quote, all the data into the raw vault before we ever pull data out. And that's just completely wrong, totally false. Technically speaking, you only need one hub and one satellite, which are two objects in the vault. At a business level, what you're really talking about is you only need one business concept and a set of descriptors in order to get value out the other side. Now, obviously, if you have a bit more than just a single business concept, if you have two business concepts that are related and you've got some descriptors around each from multiple systems, then you can begin to get some cross-tab analytics and some investigatory type of queries. Yeah, I think really scope control is extremely important. This idea that the team needs to build everything into the vault first is just flat out wrong.
I think it also stems from one of those golden rules, right? All of the data all the time. The keyword there is in scope, which people tend to forget about, which I don't understand. It's like, it's basically an end-to-end vertical slice, which we always recommend. I don't think we do anything that's not related to the business, because the data vault is about delivering value to the business. Now, if you can walk us through the process from the business to the actual delivery, like the scope of the work product. What do you mean by scope of work product from a business perspective? And what should a business expect? And even timelines, because they can vary.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about scope is, it needs to be consistent. How you approach the scoping of the work to be done is what really needs to be consistent. And the amount of the work that needs to be done, or what's called the work product, is also part of the keys to success. When you talk about agility, the last thing you want to do is bite off more than you can chew, or quote unquote boil the ocean, or use a big bang approach. Hey, look, we're going to build all of this, then build all of that, then build the next piece, and so on. That's the old waterfall style. You definitely don't want that. Now, there are some dependencies in the agile format, and you got to pay attention to those. But as long as you can scope it, you can do things right. And what I mean by that is downscope. So the first thing that you need to downscope are the number of systems that you're going to deal with. At Lockheed, we had 3.5 people on the team, and we had 125 source systems, and we were told, ingest them all, build a warehouse complete in 6 months. And you just don't get there from here without a modular approach. One of the biggest things that we realized very quickly was the use of something called a taxonomy. Now, for those of you that don't know what a taxonomy is, it is a classification. The poor man's definition of a taxonomy is a word hierarchy or a word outline. And these terms are specific to the business. Whatever business unit or business function that you're in is the first set of scope. You can start with a business like Lockheed Martin, and the next layer or level of the taxonomy are the sectors. And Lockheed had 7 sectors. And so you have 7 peers all underneath the corporation called Lockheed Martin. And then under that, you've got different terminology. So in astronautics, a tail number meant a rocket tail number. So we had a term called tail number in astronautics that was business-wide. Every business in astronautics would use that term. So we would have Lockheed Martin at the top, then we would have astronautics underneath as a child, and then underneath astronautics as a child, we would have tail number, for example. Then we'd have a definition. Now that's a business term. If you go Lockheed Martin at the top and you go to aeronautics, which is a peer to the astronautics sector, in aeronautics, they also had the word tail number, but it turns out the tail number meant instead the number of the aircraft, because aeronautics built you guessed it, aircraft. So it was a different definition, but it was still an identifier. And so what you're looking for are these terms, these business terms that allow you to construct a taxonomy or a hierarchy of your business terms. And then after you have a basic hierarchy, you really want to think about scope, not only as you're building the taxonomy. And if you can buy a taxonomy for your business, all the better, right? You've got a place to start that's predefined. And Wand Technologies has great taxonomies for sale that your business can use. My good friend Bill Inman uses them and so on. But the taxonomies and the scope process is important. So one of the things that I like to do is a prescriptive approach to scoping. First, develop the taxonomies, attach the business terms, and then say, which business terms are we going to address inside of the taxonomy? And you can do this, you can build this taxonomy in a mind mapping tool or a Word document. It really doesn't matter. But pick 2, 3, or 4 specific business terms that you know you have data for, or that you know you have identifiers for. So if you've got unique identifiers, for instance, tail numbers, that would be what we call a business key. So if you pick 2 or 3 of those, that's the first set of scope on your taxonomy that you're working with. The next way that you scope that is you go ahead and add onto the taxonomy. Not only do you add those business terms, but you add the source systems or the source applications that feed that particular business term. So you can say, well, this one comes from 50 different source systems. This tail number's in 50 out of the 125 that I mentioned. But even then, you're still out of scope for a build cycle. So you want to reduce it even further and say, okay, we're going to reduce it to 2 or 3 source systems so that we're dealing with something manageable out of the gate. Why? Because Data Vault is built on patterns. And because the patterns are repeatable, what you do for 3 source systems will work immediately for the other 47. And this is sort of where the automation tooling comes in. So there's a bit of upfront work and design in the first 1 or 2 systems, knowing and understanding what you're going to design, what you're going to build, how it's going to function, what business keys, business concepts you're looking at. And then once you have that pattern, you can plug in the metadata to these automation tools and say, well, these are the business concepts and these are the business keys. And these are the same keys or the same concepts across 50 different source systems. Press a button and say, generate our business construct called a hub, for example, and generate our satellites, our descriptors information, and generate all the load processes without error and so on. But to get back to the scope, you want to start with 2 or 3 source systems. You want to start with a single business concept, 1 or 2 business concepts that are related. Any taxonomy, if you look at a taxonomy, you can see relationships. So for instance, tail numbers on the NASA space shuttle, which used to fly, had pilots. They had 5 people associated. So there was a relationship between people or people's names or employees of NASA, if you will, or pilots and the shuttle mission. So the tail number of the shuttle, and of course the shuttle would go multiple times. It was reusable. That being said, they had different points in time. They had different pilots all through the same relationship. So there's a business key called a pilot, right? And there's a business key called a shuttle tail number. And then there's a business key called a mission. So a mission ID. When you put those together, you've got a relationship across all 3 of these things. And that's what we mean by scope. Now, what the team should focus on, and not to belabor the point, what the team should be doing from that point is only building those structures that meet that very small scope. So the stage structures, the vault structures, the business key concepts, and so on. And then putting the data out immediately in what we call intermediate output structures, which are known in the Data Vault landscape as point in time and bridge tables, to be technical. But these are intermediate output structures. From there, we allow the BI tools to query this stuff directly. When the scope is applied properly, we can get teams to move as fast as possible in development and actually deliver a prototype result to a dashboard within 4 hours or 6 hours, as long as the team knows the business concepts. And this is where some teams go wrong. You've got IT cordoned off. You've hired a team that doesn't know your business. You don't put a subject matter expert on the team, and that's a data mesh concept along with an agility concept, is you don't build silos across your teams. You actually cross-integrate your team members. That's been around for a long time, but that's embedded in the data mesh principles and it's embedded in agile principles that if you put a subject matter expert inside of the team to build, then the time to get the data out, the time to understand the data is incredibly shrunk. From there, you start producing the data, good, the bad, the ugly. It's not time during this cycle to sit there and say, well, I have to debug every little thing before a business user or an analyst sees it. No, that's not the way this works. In order to be agile, you want to get it out as fast as possible in development, using development data. You want the analyst to begin to work with it and say, well, I'm missing this element. I can't pivot it because this field is missing. This attribute is missing. Where is this piece of information that I need for this analytic, for this group buy or this aggregator, whatever. So all of that is part of the scope discussion, and it helps the team move fast. We were able to at Lockheed Martin, and we wrote our own automation tool because in the 90s, they just didn't exist like they do today. But we were able to ingest 150 different source systems with a team of 3.5 people and build outcomes. And we did it incrementally. We didn't do it overnight. We took the first 15 and in 2-3 weeks, we had those, right? What your team can do inside of a 2-week time frame, when they get good at the patterns and they get good at the scope control, they can turn around in 4 hours or less with an automation tool. And that's in development. The other beauty of the automation tool that I want to talk about from a business perspective is the fact that it reduces the amount of errors that are put into test environments and put into production environments. Again, because the patterns play out, the only thing that changes in a production environment and a test environment is the data set itself. Right? So the data values change, but that shouldn't matter. All of that development, all of those templates, all those patterns, they lead to acceleration. But the real key is understanding scope and understanding a taxonomy and reducing that scope and getting the team to produce inside of a day or 2 days or 4 hours, a work product that is in the business intelligence tool in development. The last thing I want to bring up is something that I've pitched to the businesses I've worked with over the years. Hey, the BI query tools, the ad hoc tools, the analyst tools, IT needs to get good at using them. IT should be familiar with them. IT can they the BI query tools or the analytics tools to help prototype what the business analyst might need or see or what kind of queries they might be running. We're not looking for speed here. What we're looking for is prototype agility. It's a different kind of speed. It's an implementation speed. It's a development speed. What the development team should learn to do during the scope and the production and development is run with 10 rows, 15, 100 rows, 200 rows, something that's small that allows the team to iterate fast, that will always return a query in less than 2 to 5 seconds or finish. Even if you make a mistake or the team makes a mistake and builds a Cartesian product, which I've seen happen, it still returns. And then you can deal with the Cartesian product and refactor it before it gets into production. Using the BI query tools to actually prototype the end result helps the IT team understand this is what we're going after. This is what we want to do. It's a single report. It's a single pivot table, that kind of thing.
The first thing that came to mind, especially when you're talking about the rapid prototyping and not focusing on the speed, there is an old quote by Donald Knuth, who wrote all the books on algorithms, and it is called "Premature optimization is the root of all evil in programming." There's a funny quote which really applies to that, right? Because it's like focus on the functionality first and then focus on the optimizations. And that's where, Data Vault really shines because of its separation of concerns. Now, you talked about the teams and you actually walked through the entire process. Imagine you have this same process. Teams are implementing things in 4-hour chunks or a day chunks or a week chunks, depending on whatever the capability is. But you have 10 parallel teams across the globe doing it at the same speed. That is only possible if they're trained together and they understand the terminology. So suddenly you have this incredible power to unleash this across the organization as, let's do this capture of data and actually start delivering value to the business. The aspects of Data Vault where the automation portions are completely separated out from the business portions. What I mean by that is the engineering components are always going to be the engineering components, right? That's the plumbing. Now, if you take that and we attach, it's okay, we want this kind of let's say, multiple types of teas we want to make out of this plumbing. The water comes out, we embellish it with, like, we have tea bags, different types of teas or whatever. That's the actual outcome and the outputs. That's where the creativity it can really shine, and you can actually use these expensive resources on your teams to add value to the business where it helps the business really grow. And from a business perspective, we always talk about metrics. But you talked about speed, the importance of speed to the outcomes, the speed to the outcomes. In the businesses, it is important in one way, but there are certain organizational needs where it's actually critical, whether it be like, crime fighting, where I have worked in, or whether it be healthcare. The information might be critical. So that's where the time to outcomes is actually quite important. And the time to outcomes reduces by using this modularized approach and separating concerns. A lot of people have this misconception, and the whole misconception is basically because of that Big Bang approach, which we said is a big no-no. It's like, don't boil the ocean. That's just a bad way of building out. So what I wanted to actually talk about related to this is when we talk about automation tools, they're kind of like power tools, right? They come with, you have push button magic in them, right? Like I push a button and I can generate all of these things. There is a human component in there. I know the automation tools removes all the errors. They won't be typos, for example. It won't miss a comma. But what if you give an automation tool to somebody who is not trained? Now, here's where I find it really risky, because now the person has the power of creating a lot of mistakes with automation. I want you to talk a little bit about the risks there.
Anytime you get somebody that's not trained in Data Vault, an automation tool can be very dangerous from that perspective. And there's a couple of reasons why. The automation tools in the Data Vault space or in the data warehousing space rely on templates. And these templates are either coded or being coded to match the standards that we produce in the Data Vault landscape. And the reason for standards, and one of the podcasts I asked, well, would you go to a brain surgeon to have your brain operated on who hadn't been properly trained and didn't practice the latest and the safest techniques for brain surgery, right? The answer would be no. So the same thing is with an automation tool. The individual needs to be trained in Data Vault and the automation tool, because if they're not trained in Data Vault, they're going to get into the template and go, well, I know better. I know how this code should run, and I have my own way that I've developed over 30 years or 10 years or whatever, and this template is wrong. And they change the template, and then all of a sudden, before you know it, every team is generating the wrong code. And then the teams who are using the template strike disaster because it doesn't perform, it breaks, it doesn't work in all cases. Again, I have to stress the fact that when we built the Data Vault standards, we ran 30,000 different test cases on the code and on the data sets, on the scalability, on the teams, on the methodology, on the layers and the implementation, ease of maintenance, and the whole 9 yards. So there's a reason why they work when they're followed. And when you've got a template and you've got somebody who's trained to use the right template at the right time, and you've got somebody who understands the power, then it becomes easier. And of course, some of these folks say, well, my job's going to go away. No, your job's going to change. Your focus is more on the business, understanding the taxonomies, the business terms, the ontologies. Your job is still to identify those things and still to downscope things and still to build outcomes that the business wants and really focus on the business side. Who wants to type in another select or insert into statement? I sure as heck don't. I do it all the time, but it's not something that I like to do. And just like everybody else, I make a lot of errors, a lot of typos and everything else. But I want to get back to the business. So from an automation tool perspective, let's just wrap that up and say, you got to get people trained, not just in Data Vault, but on the automation tool itself. For example, if you take someone who has never seen a torque wrench and say, okay, I want you to use this torque wrench, this thing is called a torque wrench. I want you to use this torque wrench to put this spark plug in the car. And you don't give them any training and they can't find the spark plug. That's one problem. Maybe they find the spark plug or what they think is the spark plug, and it's not. It's the oil pan plug. And next thing you know, they got oil all over their face. So this is part of it. The training is invaluable to the success of what the individual is doing. But assuming they find the spark plug and they put the torque wrench on it, what if they weren't trained to turn left or turn right? Next thing you know, they cross-thread the spark plug. Maybe they tighten the spark plug too much so it can't get it out. or it shatters inside the engine and the bits are now inside the engine block, and the cost just balloons up to fix that kind of a problem. So this is what we're talking about with the tools and the training. It's very, very important. Did you have some thoughts
Yeah,
around
I
that?
wanted to add to your brain surgeon analogy, just because how far technology has gone today. So if you think about today, it is possible for surgery to be done remotely. You can actually have a surgeon at the other end of the globe via the internet, operating machinery on the other side that is actually doing surgery. Now, just imagine the surgeon, the level of training you want of the surgeon, not just in his field, but also on the tooling. So it actually goes exactly the way you were talking about. It's like the brain surgeon analogy is like you really want somebody trained both in their field of work and on the tooling. I mean, it's paramount to the success of any project. And this is where honestly, the return on investment on any of these things is usually through the roof. I think you talked about Lockheed, but in Lockheed Martin, weren't you able to turn your team from a cost center into a profit center?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, that had to do with the chargeback system they had. And the way that worked in a nutshell was our team was constantly charging money to the business to build. That's the way it works, right? And the business had our team on a quote charge number, which attached us to an estimate, which attached us to a funding level at the business and so on. It was all very regulated because the part of the business I was working in was regulated to the federal government. So that's the nature of how that works. But we were able to go to a profit center because we got our work done so fast. And the reason was, and I'll finish up with this, with Lockheed Martin, we were able to go from what other teams were estimating as a 90-day work product, we were able to turn around in under 4 hours. And this was in the 90s, late 90s, right? And that's amazing. Back then, we took essentially 90-day work product and estimated 4 hours. In development, mind you, it took another 2 hours or so to get it through test, and then we got it into production. So we never did anything on Friday because you don't roll into production on Friday. That's just a no-no. That was the prioritization phase for next week. But what happened was we got so good at it, we actually had the taxonomy sheet of terms that we handed to the business users and said, this is what we have in the warehouse. And the terms were defined. So they came with definitions. Sometimes there were calculations added. So additional fields were added to the taxonomy underneath. Say, for instance, rocket tail number, there was a calculation that said we want to know how much this rocket cost at each stage of production. And there was manufacturing and development, planning, design, so on and so forth. And so there were different calculations that went into that. And each one of those calculations was actually annotated on the taxonomy. So we'd hand these to the business users, the analysts, and they would say, I want this, I want that, I don't want this. And we had a place on the form where they could write in their own calculations if they needed something special. And they were limited to using what was on the taxonomy. So they could say this term on the taxonomy multiplied by that term and da-da-da-da-da. So they would put the formulas down. Of course, we'd have to have a meeting with them to get precise requirements, but it gave us a scope. From the time they handed us the sheet to the time we developed a prototype was a 4-hour turnaround time. And that was in development. When we showed them the answer 4 hours later, they could then approve or deny or say, that wasn't exactly what I asked for. Let's change it. So we were moving at the speed of business back then. That had never been done before inside of Lockheed. No IT team had ever moved that fast. And to finish up that story, what happened was word spread among the business analysts around the world. And all of a sudden, every business sponsor and every business analyst wanted our team to do their work because we were so fast. They didn't want to pay for the 90 days and they didn't want to wait for the 90 days for other teams to do it. And there's more stories to that than meets the eye. But at the end of the day, what happened was other business sponsors came and paid our business sponsor basically to queue up their project as next in line so that our team would get it done and get the data in the warehouse so they could have their results quickly. And that's how we turned our team into a profit center for our business sponsor.
Capitalism within the organization. That's kind of cool.
Absolutely. You got to be profitable. And it's funny because to be agile means you're going to turn a profit for your company. I mentioned this in a different podcast. It is time for IT to, quote, grow up and learn that it is a business function. It isn't just technology. It's a business function with technical skills. And to be a business, IT needs to manage itself like a business. This means estimates. This means actuals. This means metrics. This means if you did something wrong, you fix it and you get better at it. This means cost analysis and where did we go wrong and where were we out of scope and why didn't we deliver on time, and let's fix it, right, and make it better. The good news is much of that's built into the Data Vault 2.0 methodology. So if you leverage the 2.0 methodology, you can get these points of success in your teams around the world.
Yeah, kind of cool. I think there's the data science example as well. I guess we can touch on that in our next episode, where NetQuote was able to make money off of the data vault and sell off the company. We'll talk about that with some data science aspects. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think we'll do that next time. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this podcast enlightening. If your team is doing Data Vault and says it's difficult or it takes any more than 2 weeks, then they're doing it wrong. They probably don't understand scope. And yeah, we can help you. Contact us and we'll get your team going in the right direction.
All right. This is Sanjay Pande.
And this is Dan Linstedt saying thank you very much for listening. We'll see you in another podcast.